climate change is changing our lives in ways in which almost no other international issue or agreement has. And it is important that while we look at the action that is needed at a policy level, we also look at the larger impact of this change on our lives both today and tomorrow. We have noted that it has already started having a change on our lives. I apologize for being late, and consequently I need to apologize for Air India for being late, and consequently I need to apologize for the monsoon gods for the uncertainty that they have brought into the process. And I think that is what we understand most by climate change today. The greater uncertainty in our lives. As I would like to discuss this issue with you today, I would like to break it up into three parts. The focus, of course, is Paris, but then the three parts is before Paris, Paris, and after Paris. Now, in the many, many years that we have been negotiating in the climate negotiations, India has come to the negotiations with the very clear understanding that a very large part of our country still doesn't have adequate access to energy, and certainly does not, most people do not even have an adequate amount of energy so that they can have sustainable lifestyles. This immediately leads to the question, well, how much? I am an empiricist, and the way I did it is that I looked at all the countries of the world and saw what it took to reach a sustainable lifestyle. Not a sustainable lifestyle, a good lifestyle. And when I looked at countries which had, and I'm using this as a rule of thumb, a human development index of 0.9 or more, each one of them had an energy consumption of 4 tons of oil equivalent per person per year. Tons of oil equivalent is a way of putting together the coal you use, the oil you use, the electricity you use, all of it jumbled up and put into one metric, which is easy to understand. So, no country in the world has been able to have a human development index of 0.9 or more without an energy supply of at least 4 tons of oil equivalent per person per year. But this also has a good part. The good part is the countries that industrialized early have used more energy, and those which have industrialized later have used less. So it's the Japans and the Koreas which are at 4 tons of oil equivalent per capita, which tells us that as we move towards a society in which people have sustainable livelihoods and a good quality of life, we could be able to do this with a lower amount of energy supply. So, without getting into the details, my own feeling is that over the next about 25 years, we should be able to do this not at 4, but somewhere nearer 3. But where are we? We are at 0.6, 0.7. In other words, it's a good 4 to 5 times more energy consumption that would be needed for people to have lifestyles which we can say are reasonable and good. We do not have experience of any other paradigms. This is the only paradigm that we know of how do you get people to have a good quality of life. So now, if this is the case, if the amount of energy has to increase, how do we integrate it with climate change? Traditionally, the vast amount of energy that has been produced in India, used in India, has been from fossil fuels which have had a necessary byproduct, which is carbon dioxide. So, the only way we knew of moving towards a better life for people was through an increased amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. Consequently, we argue in the international fora that if India has to move towards a path in which the carbon dioxide emissions are less, we would need to move to technologies which produce the same amount of services, whether it's transport, whether it is lighting, whether it's air conditioning, whether it is in industries, which are able to provide the same services but with lower carbon dioxide emissions, largely moving us into the realm of renewables. Now, renewables cost much more. And therefore, the traditional Indian position has been that yes, we can make this transition to a lower carbon economy, but as long as there is an adequate supply both of technologies which are lower carbon and of finances which help us meet the additional costs of those technologies. So that has been the traditional view. Now, what happened in the past 4, 5, 6, 7 years is that for a variety of reasons which had peripherally anything to do with global warming, but had more to do with the fact that we import more and more of our fossil fuels, which has a huge impact on the macroeconomics of the country. The fact that increasing fossil fuel consumption implies that urban quality becomes worse. The fact that even with all of this consumption, there isn't adequate energy so that every Indian has access to adequate energy. If you look at all of these, clearly we need to enhance both renewables and energy efficiency. That's the only way we can move towards both having adequate access and a cleaner India, and ensuring that these internal resources, whether it's efficiency or renewables, do not place further pressure on the balance of payments. So, how do we do it? And the past few years taught us a few lessons. The first is in the area of renewables. In the area of renewables, if you want to get a kilowatt hour of electricity from solar, it used to cost about 18 rupees in 2012. In wind, what we had seen was that in about 2002, 2003, in Maharashtra, the price of wind was about 3 rupees 50 paisa per kilowatt hour. Now, what happened by 2015 was that the price of solar energy had already dropped to less than 6, and today it is about 4 rupees 30. Why did that happen? Because of a particular manner in which we said, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do it at a big scale. We launched the National Solar Program, and that the bulk procurement and repeated bulk procurement provided the confidence both to the buyers as well as to the sellers of the equipment that there is a market and prices come. In a very, very similar manner, on the energy efficiency side, there are many things that have happened, but one which, by way of anecdote, provides a huge amount of learning is on the lighting side, where even in 2013, we realized that we need to move towards much more efficient lighting. We need to move towards LEDs. LED lighting, which uses half as much electricity as CFLs, and 1/10 as much electricity as a regular bulb. Even in 2013, when you went to the market to buy it, it used to cost about 500 rupees, but would pay back for itself in 3 years. Yet, you and I were not buying it. And we were not buying it because we saw that it as a heavy price, and if it fused, you lost a lot of money. Consequently, what we put together was a new business model in which a newly made company, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, got into a contract with distribution companies, for example, MSCTCL or Tata Power or BSES. And through them, provided LEDs to you and I, and we could pay for it at 10 rupees per month. Now that was affordable. They also said if it fuses, it will be replaced, no questions asked in the first 3 years. On the other side, what they did was they procured it in bulk because they were selling it to all of us. And when they procured it in bulk for the first time in January 2014, it was 310 rupees. When they procured it for the 6th time in March this year, the price had dropped to 53 rupees. 310 rupees to 53 rupees. In other words, the technology was here and it was affordable. And by the way, both the solar and the LED were not at small numbers. They were in the review PV, they were in thousands of megawatts of PV. In LEDs, we have already sold, I think, if I'm not wrong, something like nearly 14 crore, 140 million LEDs as of yesterday. You can go to a website which tells you how many have been sold every 15 seconds. So, we went to Paris with a mindset that was somewhat different from the earlier mindset, knowing that we had the capacity, largely because of our numbers, to be able to establish large markets and use those both to draw technology in and to drive prices down. Consequently, the mindset was different and the framework was different. At the same time, globally, what had been happening was there was a huge amount of pressure on countries like India and China to take on mitigation measures. Now, because of the reason I told you that people in India hardly use any energy, that energy has to grow if you plan to have a better quality of life, CO2 will increase. There is no way that a country like India or even China can agree that our greenhouse gas emissions can decrease in the short term. In fact, they will increase and increase substantially. This led to the issue which had already been addressed by the time of the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, that we would promise not to reduce our emissions, but to reduce the emissions intensity of our economy, that is the emissions per unit of GDP. We will grow, but each unit of growth will be more efficient from a carbon point of view than the last unit of growth was. Therefore, before Copenhagen, we had made a unilateral commitment, a suo motu commitment, that the carbon intensity of our economy in 2020 would be 22%, 20-25% less than it was in 2005. Now, what was very clear is that if there is a global regime in which every country has to decrease its emissions, India could not be part of it. Therefore, we also had huge problems with calculations that were done as to how much India should reduce, because when they came from the West, those calculations were, you are going to grow. And therefore, it is that growth between different countries which has to be curtailed. So what it did was, it grandfathered what the earlier emissions were. Now this was a problematic concept. We said that if we have to have, it has to be an allocation, and Professor Jayaraman is the Indian leader, the global leader in the concept that if you need to have a carbon budget, the carbon budget needs to be based on the overall emissions and not just the increase in emissions. Short point, we were unable to reach a negotiated position on how this could happen. So, what was clear to us was we cannot agree to a reduction in emissions. It was clear to us that a global agreement would have to come into place. It was also clear that a numbers-based regime, which is globally acceptable, was not there. So this is all the things that we knew when we went to Paris. So to summarize, we went to Paris knowing that technologies had to be at the heart of a low-carbon future, that this change is really about ensuring how do you get in higher cost technologies and put in business models through which more and more people can adopt it, and that use technology evolution to bring down costs and enhance their performance. So as I said, we went to Paris with a slightly different mindset than what we had gone to previous negotiations before that. So now we are in Paris. One of the things in the couple of years leading to Paris was that there was a broad agreement that every country had to say what it could do. And therefore the intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs, were set up and presented by India and by many, many other countries. I think before Paris, something like 170 countries had submitted what they would do, which accounted for over 80% of the global emissions. Now, as that happened, and you added them up, they clearly weren't enough to keep the world below the goal of less than 2 degrees. Okay, so what do we do? And therefore, at Paris, I think there were a few things that were important. One was the recognition that all countries have to do something. The second was the recognition that it is going to be very difficult to have a global framework to determine what each country should do, and therefore each country will pledge what it can do. The third was that when you add up all these pledges, they are not adequate, so they need to be ratcheted up. So, said, okay, this is good, but how do we get people to ratchet up? What is the kind of rationale for it? What is the kind of social dynamics which would help bring this about? And consequently, the other major move ahead in Paris was the creation of the transparency mechanism through which all countries, including India, would periodically put in the public domain what is it that they are doing, what is the progress that they have achieved towards meeting the pledges that they have made. This would then feed into a global exercise called stock taking, where the countries of the world would then look at the stock taking and use that to see how much more ambitious should they be and can they be. This was a completely different way of looking at the climate architecture from the earlier Kyoto Protocol. In the earlier Kyoto Protocol, where the developed countries only had emission reduction targets, had been criticized for the fact that everybody was not included. The US Senate had somewhat self-servingly said that we will not join it till India and China does. But to me, what was far more damning of that architecture is the fact that as it reached its terminal years, and as countries found that they could not meet their targets, they stepped out. Australia, Canada, Japan said we will not go in for a second period. And therefore it behooves the question is an architecture worth it when people say yes we will come in and then leave it when they find that they can't? In the Paris architecture, each country is pledging what it will do. So we are ourselves pledging, nobody else is telling us. And therefore the chances that we will meet our pledge are far higher than if it had been kind of pushed it on us from the top. Now as we achieve our goal, it gives us the confidence that we can achieve more. And it gives our negotiating partners the trust that we can deliver. And I believe that this mutual trust and confidence, this cycle of mutual trust and confidence has therefore, the capacity to create the social dynamics that are needed for the ratcheting up that is called for, and for countries to actually achieve and then do more. So this pledge, achieve and then pledge more kind of mechanism is actually something which I personally, and I will confess that I'm a hopeless optimist, that there is a chance of success. I think it's also worthwhile focusing on the transparency mechanism. Till now, the only place where, in a sense, negotiation has occurred on climate change has been the climate change conferences. And the people who are there are countries. So there has been a global discussion between countries on what we should do on climate change. What the transparency mechanism could do is to put each one of us with knowledge, possibly incomplete, of what our own countries do. And therefore, with this knowledge, we can hold ourselves and our governments to task. The transparency mechanism, in my view, has the potential, and that's something that I'd like to focus on in greater detail. I believe it has the potential to convert a global political debate into a domestic policy debate. And that, I believe, is at the heart then of our being able to achieve our pledges. So to summarize, as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, this is one more thing that I should have focused on. One of the things also that Paris did, and Professor Jayaraman had briefly alluded to it, was that we said that we will not only try to keep the world's temperature at 2 degrees below the pre-industrial average, but actually try to keep it at less than 1.5. I frankly don't think that's possible. The 1.5 is certainly not possible, and unless there are very, very strong allocations made, and then there are mechanisms to ensure that we keep within those within those allocations, the arithmetic says that the 1.5 is not possible. 2, maybe, but even that is going to be a tough call, and I hope that that's one of the things that you discuss today and tomorrow. One of the other things that happened was that this time we noted that it was not only us who was drumming for technology. A large number of countries believed that countries had to work together to develop and deploy newer technologies. This was a sea change. And the establishment of the International Solar Alliance, in which India had taken a leading role, the launch of the mission Innovation, in which the US took a leading role, signaled an acceptance by countries that technological collaboration is a key part of making us go ahead. However, having said that, the linkages of the technological collaboration mechanisms with the main agreement are nebulous. They're very, very weak. They actually, in a sense, don't exist. Similarly, if these things cost more, there is no new talk of how this additional financing would happen. So, it is not as if the Paris Agreement is all great. It is great. It is great in terms of having an architecture which I believe has a greater chance of success. But it also has issues that it does not, that the technology and finance linkages are weak. The fact that while we said we will try to move towards 1.5, the arithmetic was not looked at. And another very important thing, adaptation is clearly and also be a core runner. The Paris Agreement is largely about mitigation. I think we have to see a Paris Agreement on adaptation that is yet to come. So, to come to the last part, so what do we do in India? We have already said that what our intended nationally determined contributions will be, which we have to meet by 2030, and those are that the emissions intensity of our economy would be 33 to 35% less in 2030 than it was in 2005. Remember, in Copenhagen we had said that our 2020 emissions intensity would be 20 to 25% less as compared to 2005. So we are moving along the same path. We also said that at least 40% of the electricity generating capacity in the country would come from non-fossil fuels. We also said that 2.5 to 3 billion tons of tree and forest cover, of carbon dioxide absorption would be from tree and forest cover. There were 4 or 5 other INDCs as well, but they are not quantitative. They are in adaptation, they are in technology, they are in finance. Now, so on the one hand, we have to put into place the processes that help us move towards achieving the INDCs. And on the second, we also have to make sure that the transparency mechanism is actually put into practice. So these are the 2 large goals that we have for India coming out of Paris. As far as the INDCs are concerned, very soon after we came back, the Prime Minister constituted a group of 11 secretaries to the Government of India to figure out how is it that we can enhance energy efficiency and move towards reducing the carbon intensity of the economy. That group has done several measures, and 2 of those are now at the cusp of being announced. One is on agricultural pump sets. So have some kind of a program similar to the LED program that I described earlier. If farmers don't have an incentive to invest in energy efficient pumps, well, let's see if we can buy energy efficient pumps in bulk, bring prices down, provide them to farmers, and the electricity company then pays back from the savings that it gets. There is some feeling that this may be announced on the 15th of August. On the renewable side, there is on the 40% non-fossil fuel side, this will largely have to be renewables. The amount of hydroelectricity that we can add in this very dense and populous country is relatively small. Nuclear, again, this takes a huge amount of time. Even under the best of scenarios, if each person in this room agreed that nuclear is a good option, I still don't see us adding more than 10,000 megawatts over the next 15 years. Maybe 15,000, but those are the kind of numbers. In other words, the vast bulk would have to come from renewables. Renewables will essentially go up from about 30,000 megawatts today to something of the order of 320,000, 330,000 megawatts in 2030, if these goals are to be met. Now that creates a separate problem. And the problem is, what happens when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? We still need electricity. In other words, you have to have a backup. That makes things expensive. Or you put up storage systems, whether it is pumped storage today or whether it is batteries tomorrow. Again, it is a matter of cost, it's also a matter of integration, it's a matter of technology. Why will somebody set up a battery-based system of storage or even a pumped storage system? They will only do it if they know that their electricity has a need and will be bought. So in the regulatory systems, we need to make the changes for creating markets for balancing power for ancillary services. We need to invest in the technology development that is needed, for example, for batteries of tomorrow. So those are the kinds of challenges that we face as far as the INDCs are concerned. On the transparency side, what is the kind of information that you and I need in order to ensure that we have a good idea of what is going on, that we can make